高斐利 （Philip Garnier） 曾在希尔顿、雅高等公司任职，自2018年起担任洲际酒店集团第三方分销副总裁。酒店分销渠道在未来有哪些趋势？有哪些创新技术将对酒店分销产生重要影响？让我们一起欢迎洲际酒店集团第三方分销副总裁 Philip Garnier。
大家好，我叫高斐利，是洲际酒店集团的分销副总裁。让我介绍一下酒店分销。Hi everyone, my name is Philip Garnier and I'm Vice President of Distribution for Intercontinental Hotels Group, and I'd like to talk to you about the complex topic of hotel distribution. So if we move to the first slide, you can see that the China landscape is one you will be very familiar with a number of players which either specialize in e-commerce in general or in travel distribution in particular. And as many of you know, most of the key players in China have capital relationships with three main groups, being Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. So we're not going to go through the shareholdings of each, but it's really important to know that all these players tend to gravitate somewhere around the three main groups. Now, if we think of leisure distribution in China, of course, we have a number of players as we have seen, but it's fair to say that there persists a number of more traditional players, such as wholesalers, name you can see on the left side of the slide, as well as proper tour operators who sell travel packages, and these travel packages include flights and hotels. Obviously, the year 2020 with the global pandemic has created lots of upheavals. And so what I'm talking about here is a bit of the structure we have known before the pandemic. And unfortunately, I do not know what the future is made of, but we can have still some reasonable expectations on future developments. Now, I apologize if I move to the next slide and we talk about, what is hotel distribution. Well, I apologize for the complex slide, but what I want to illustrate here is the fact that from a hotel's perspective, everything that touches distribution revolves around the central reservation system of the hotel. That's the box we call CRS here. And then on the left of the slide, you can see brand websites. It's very important for each hotel chain, for major hotel chains, to distribute its products in priority through its own capabilities, such as the brand websites or the apps. Over time, mostly in the US and in Europe, the middle column we can see here has developed where you have GDS, who supply rates and inventory to travel management companies, who in turn are being used by larger corporations. So that's the chain that's typically being used, say, in Europe or the US. And then when it comes to leisure distribution, we have, of course, OTAs as well as wholesalers, as we've talked about. And these OTAs, online travel agencies or wholesalers, typically get access to the rates and availability of the hotel, either directly through a connection to the central reservation system of the chain, or through what we call a switch, companies like Derbysot or Sheti. And these switch companies help connect the CRS of the hotel on the one hand with the distribution system of the distributors on the other hand. Now, if we move to the next slide, a concern that's very important when it comes to the complex topic of distribution is really around rate parity. Rate parity is important for the following reason. Like I've said a minute ago, most chains will try and distribute in priority through their own direct capabilities, such as the brand website or the app, right? Say IHG.com, Marriott.com, Hilton.com, and so on. Now, in order to convince customers that it's a good idea to book directly with a chain, of course, the customer needs to be sure that the best rates are going to be found on the chain's direct channels, such as the app or the web. And that's why most chains, including IHG, have put in place a so-called best price guarantee to reassure customers that the best rates, in effect, can be found on the direct channels. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into all the details, but there are instances where rate parity is not abided by. And so all chains are really working hard together with our distribution partners to make sure that for the same product, the same product is sold on parity across all channels. Now, I've just spent a few minutes describing to you something you're probably very familiar with, and I apologize, by the way, because I really wish I could be here with you in Shanghai, but unfortunately the borders are still closed, and so I have to resort to this video. Anyway, what I've been describing before you is probably some things you're very aware of, right? That's kind of the distribution landscape in China and in the world we've all been very familiar with. The real question we need to ask ourselves is, of course, the hotel industry has known in 2020 a massive amount of disruption that had never been seen before. And it's quite reassuring to see how China domestically has stabilized and how business is coming back up. Some other areas of the world are not quite there yet, but I do hope we've seen the worst before us. So in our jobs, we have to start asking ourselves, well, what's coming next? Do we anticipate that the world will completely go back to normal and that, say, 2021 or 22 will be the exact same things as 2019? Well, I don't think so, because the pace of change is accelerating and the pace of innovation is accelerating. And so what I want to show here is on the right-hand side of the slide. Let's talk a bit about innovations that will, in my opinion, have a likely impact on hotel distribution. And then on the bottom right, some innovations that may have, I want to say, a more distant impact. So let's talk about mobile first. If you reside in China, you don't need me to tell you that mobile is the way you conduct all your business. And so when it comes to hotels, for years, it's because, actually remember years and years ago when 60% of Ctrip's business was conducted out of a huge call center near Hongqiao Airport in Shanghai, right? Today, if I'm not mistaken, a vast majority of Ctrip's business is conducted not just online, but through the app. I don't think there's anyone in China left who would use a desktop to make a hotel booking. So mobile first is a key criterion when it comes to how travel is consumed and will continue to be consumed in the future. The next one we want to talk about is concentration. As we've seen before, the China hotel distribution landscape on surface seems to be very fragmented with a number of players who are either travel specialists or who are e-commerce players that happen to have a travel presence. But you have, say, two dominant players called Ctrip and Alibaba. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that competition, that healthy competition between the two pans out over the next few years. Now, let's talk a bit about automation, artificial intelligence, and chatbots. There are remarkable applications that you can see with chatbots, say with a call center that can really help give customers a great experience. But now I want to talk to you a bit about the things on the left-hand side of the slides, which are realities within the hotel business that hold us back from benefiting from all these innovations I'm talking about. So on front, if you're a consumer, the chatbot can really help facilitate your web experience or your call center experience. That's great. But the issue is that we are talking in the hotel business about a number of issues we have to be aware of. First one is, I've shown you earlier that the central reservation system is key in terms of hotel distribution. But as you know, many large chains have thousands of hotels, 6,000 hotels, 7,000 hotels. Huazhu has got even more, I think, right? So you have one CRS, and then in some chains, you have actually a number of property management systems who may differ by property. So there's a real challenge in terms of data management to ensure that all the information that you have residing in 6,000 PMS goes up and down and up and down to the CRS, right? That's sort of single image inventory or compliance between the CRS and the PMS data is a big issue. Similarly, when it comes to the infrastructure of hotel chains in general tend to have somewhat old legacy systems. Again, you don't need me to tell you there's been massive leaps in terms of computing over the last few years where, a few years ago, you had like a server, a central reservation system used to sit in a box and you could go to the data center and look at the box. Now, obviously, with the rise of cloud computing and web services, the evolution of systems is that you don't build a box that only does one thing. You go and pick services in the cloud that perform a specific business function when you want it. Okay, so this transition from legacy systems to web-based, cloud-based and web services is something that is still happening today, which to an extent prevents us from benefiting from all the consumer-friendly things that, say, artificial intelligence and chatbot can offer. But back to that in a second. Let's talk about the rate selling strategy for a second. As many of you know, a hotel is a complex thing with, a few hundred rooms. And each room may have specificities in terms of view, in terms of equipment, furniture, and so on. And then each room may have different types of bedding, single beds, king, queen. And then you have different price points. You have the best flexible rate, and then you may have an advanced purchase rate, and then you have maybe a promotional rate, and then you have a rate with breakfast, and so on. So if you take all this, right, you look for, let's say you look for a hotel in Sanya, at a resort in Sanya. And you start comparing the hotels in Sanya, you start comparing the resorts. The minute you start looking at one particular hotel, you may have 10 or 15 or 20 different combinations between the room type, the bed type, the view, and so on. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you give the guest as much choice as possible without completely overwhelming the guest? And that's actually quite tricky, right? Thinking about which products do you offer to which guests. And then one of the last thing we have to contend with is a 360 view of the customer. Large hotel chains historically have been struggling with having a 360 view of the customer, because if you go to the Hotel Indigo in Shanghai, for example, and I've stayed there, and maybe the front desk has noted I like a certain kind of pillow. If now I go to a Crown Plaza in Sanya, it's a different hotel that has a different PMS that doesn't necessarily have access to the notes that the Hotel Indigo in Shanghai has made. And therefore, this preference, assume that I care about pillows, which I don't, but that particular preference about the type of pillow is going to be lost next time I get to another hotel. And so what I'm trying to illustrate here on the left side of the slide is that there are legacy issues that big hotel chains are currently working through. that prevent us to an extent from benefiting from all the advances in technology that I'm talking about here, right? So chatbot is cool, but if you can automate a number of things, but if in the back end you don't have a good view of the customer, you don't know how the customer has interacted with you before, you don't know how many times the guest has stayed with you before, it's going to be tricky. The same goes with artificial intelligence, right? Intellectually, I can see how great it is to automate a few processes, but to do that, you need to have reliable data in the first place. And then when it comes to blockchain, I'm very curious, like everybody else. I've heard of blockchain for a few years. I can intellectually understand the appeal of blockchain in terms of securing transactions, right, through the ledger. You know exactly what's been happening at each step, and it's all certified, cannot be falsified. That's great. However, what I do know is that if you start to apply the blockchain technology on a central reservation system of a big chain, one thing is going to happen. It's going to slow the central reservation system down so much that it's going to grind to a halt, and then it's not going to be able to process the millions of reservations per day it has to process. So, in other words, blockchain might be cool and might have lots of great applications in the future, but for the moment, it really stands in contradictions with having a central reservation system that's efficient and that can do what it has to do. And so, if we think again about the future, especially when it comes to China distribution, of course the jury's out and nobody's got a crystal ball. But what we can see is we have two types of players. We have travel specialists such as Ctrip or Elong or Tunia or Fliggy. And then we have generalists platform, e-commerce platforms such as Meituan and WeChat, of course, and Xiaohongshu and JD, Pinduoduo, and so on, and Taobao, and so on, right? So these are massive, massive e-commerce undertakings in China. And so again, I wish I had a crystal ball, and I really don't know how it's going to pan out, but it's definitely something that we will need to watch to see whether the future of travel booking in China is going to be more in the hands of travel specialists or more in the hands of platform generalists. Okay, so I can see we have a few questions. Well, it's always hard to predict the future. It's even harder at a time that is so unpredictable. I think for me, the biggest unknown is whether the segments that we've seen, that we thought were normal so far, will come back as they were. So for example, if you take a large hotel chain, and let's say for simplification's sake that a third of your business is corporate, and a third of your business is leisure, and a third of your business is groups. Well, you know, in some regions of the world, the leisure business has more or less kept up, but the large corporate business and the groups has significantly dropped. So as the rest of the world emerges from the pandemic eventually, it's going to be interesting to see to which extent the segments change, go back to what they were, or change. And so that, in my opinion, will be a main driver on how the channels will evolve. In other words, the breakdown between TMCs versus OTAs versus direct channels. I think we all love to look at the future, and we all love to think of disruptive technologies that will all of a sudden revolutionize the hotel industry. I think we all think of artificial intelligence, we think of blockchain, we think of technologies. And like we've illustrated before, I certainly cannot say that none of them will play a role. That would be foolish. However, it's really hard to predict how soon they will catch up. And again, I think the issue is not so much the technologies themselves and the added value they can represent, but it's more how they stack up with the legacy systems that hotel chains have been having to contend with, and more specifically, how the hotel-based systems, such as the PMS, for example, actually communicate with the central capabilities such as the CRS. So really what I'm trying to say is, yes, of course, there will be disruption. And yes, of course, I can imagine that artificial intelligence will catch up. But it can only start to make a difference once a lot of, let's say, unglamorous work is done between the hotels and the hotel chains in terms of upgrading the traditional, the legacy infrastructure, if you like. It's actually an interesting development that both in Europe and in the US, Google seems to be very much the focus of interest from the authorities. I think the authorities are starting to look at a number of factors, such as dominant position. I think it's healthy that competition authorities look at these aspects for the sake of consumer protection. I think it's really hard to predict where this will land. I think in a way, customers have been quite willing to access services for free in exchange for providing their personal data. And so I suppose it doesn't have to be this way. There could be other models where customers would be more willing to pay for services such as search or maps or many services in exchange for keeping their privacy more intact. I think for the moment, though, what's been happening is that customers have been quite content to worry less about privacy and more about getting access to free services. But who knows, that might change in the future. Well, again, thank you, everyone. I apologize I couldn't be with you live. I really wish I could. I hope I've been able to illustrate some of the interesting points with travel distribution, hotel distribution today and in the future. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. 谢谢，再见。